All right, we are now going to go through the last two pages of our notes for Unit 7 classification. We're looking at page 5 and page 6, and we're basically doing a quick run through of all the biological kingdoms. We have already talked about the two bacterial kingdoms, eubacteria and archaebacteria. So now we're going to move into the kingdoms that are in the domain Eukarya. So the first kingdom that we'll take a look at is Kingdom Protista. So members of the Kingdom Protista are single-celled or multicellular organisms that don't fit into any other kingdom. This is sort of the it's a throwaway kingdom is not the right word, but the organisms that go into this kingdom are there primarily because they don't really fit into any other kingdom, even though they do tend to be fairly similar in their characteristics. But basically, it's a kingdom. Kingdom Protista is a kingdom of mostly one-celled or single-celled eukaryotic organisms that are different from plants, animals, bacteria, and fungi. Mostly we're talking about single-celled organisms, although there are some significant multicellular organisms in the kingdom Protista. So examples of organisms in this kingdom are things like amoeba and euglena. These are single-celled protists, the kinds of things that you find living in ponds. They're microscopic in size. And over here on the right, you have a picture of a euglena, a really nice picture of a euglena, which is actually an interesting protist because it has some characteristics of plants and some characteristics of animals. Okay, so unlike bacteria, all protists are eukaryotes. So again, what that means is that they have a nucleus in their cell. So even though most of them are single-celled, like bacteria, one of the major differences, the primary difference between the organisms that are in the kingdom Protista from bacteria is that they have a nucleus and membrane-bound organelles in their cells. So they're eukaryotes, organisms whose cells have a nucleus and organelles enclosed by membranes. Okay, so in looking at the kingdom Protista, there are two major types of protists. Basically, we have what are called protozoans, and we have what are called algae. So protozoans are members of the kingdom Protista that have animal-like characteristics, and actually this ZO in protozoans comes from the same root as our word zoology and the word zoo, which what do you find at zoos? Well, you find animals. So protozoans are protists that are like animals. Algae is a more commonly used everyday kind of word because we encounter algae sometimes in ponds or in a fish tank or something. But algae are members of the kingdom Protista that have plant-like characteristics. So these protists they generally will have chloroplasts in their cells so they can perform photosynthesis. They don't really move around. They don't eat other organisms. And the protozoans are different. They will tend to not have cell walls in their single cell. They move around, swim around freely, often consume other protists or other food material. They consume it. They don't perform photosynthesis. All right, so that's a quick overview of the kingdom Protista. We will have another unit that is just where we just focus on protists. All right, so our next kingdom that we'll look at under the domain Eukarya are the fungi. So this is kingdom fungi. So this is one of the first organisms that scientists realized didn't really fit into plant or animal groups were the fungi. So if you remember, way back in Linnaeus' time and prior to that, scientists generally, all the way back to Aristotle, scientists generally classified living things as either being plants or animals. And that was it. The only two groups they have. So you would assume that they would call fungi plants under this categorization or this classification system. But if you really study fungi, like mushrooms and this sort of thing, you will realize fairly quickly that they're not exactly like plants. They do a lot of things very differently from plants. So, in fact, they are not plants. They're in their own kingdom. So the kingdom fungi is a kingdom made up of non-green, and so actually non-green there is said with a point because plants are green. They tend to be green. Fungi tend to not be green. So it's a kingdom made up of non-green eukaryotic organisms that have cell walls, reproduce by using spores, and get food by breaking down substances in their surroundings and absorbing nutrients. So like plants, the cells of fungi will have cell walls. We haven't spent any time looking at fungal cells up to this point, but they reproduce using spores. But unlike plants, they get their food by breaking down substances in their surroundings and absorbing nutrients. In fact, a lot of fungi are really important decomposers, which is a special type of consumer that breaks down dead organic material. All right, and so this is our kingdom fungi. So some examples of fungi that I've already mentioned, we've got mushrooms, also molds, and yeast is a commonly encountered fungi that we use in cooking and baking bread and this sort of thing. Yeast is actually one of the examples of fungi that is a single-celled organism. Most fungi are in fact multicellular organisms, but some are single-celled, and like I just said, yeast is a great example of a single-celled fungi. Now, all fungi, like plants, have cell walls in their cells. So unlike animal cells, which never have cell walls, all fungi also have a cell wall like plants do. And this is typical of organisms that are not mobile, organisms that just stay in one place. They tend to be more rigid, and so having a cell wall helps them to maintain that rigidity in their body structure. So fungi, the way they work is they use digestive juices to break down substances outside of their bodies, and then they absorb the nutrients up into their body. So you think of another well-known fungi. This is athlete's foot is a fungal infection, and so basically what you have is you have a fungus that's living on the skin of your feet, and that fungus is secreting digestive juices, digesting some of the skin cells on your feet, and absorbing those nutrients into its body, and to you that feels itchy or something like that. So that's something to help you remember the way that fungi feed, the way they consume their food. All right, and over here we have on the right side we've got a picture of a well-known mushroom. It is genus Amanita, excuse me. It's got the red cap on its mushrooms with white sort of white wart-like structures, very poisonous, but also a very beautiful and good example of a typical mushroom. All right, so the next kingdom that we'll take a look at is the kingdom Plantae. So obviously this is the kingdom that contains plants. Excuse me. Most people easily recognize members of the plant kingdom. Like I said back during Aristotle's day, this was one of the two categories that people came up with. We had plants and we had animals, and so plants have been well known for centuries and centuries, thousands of years and more. So Plantae, though, is the kingdom made up of plants, but these are complex, multicellular organisms. They're usually green in color. They have cell walls in their cells, and they perform photosynthesis. So, for example, examples of plants are mosses, ferns, pine trees, and flowering plants. And I actually listed all the major types of plants there. We have mosses, ferns, pine trees, and flowering plants. All plants are multicellular. There's not one plant that's not multicellular. If you have something that's plant-like but is only single-celled, it would be in the algae category. It would be a protist. In the kingdom Protista, it would be one of the algae. Now, because plants use photosynthesis to obtain food, plants can be found in land and in water, or wherever sunlight can penetrate. So anywhere you have sunlight on Earth, you'll find plants there, because plants use that sunlight to produce food. But if you are someplace where there is no sunlight, like maybe down at the bottom of the ocean or deep down in a cave, you don't find plants in these locations because they're unable to perform photosynthesis. Now, nearly all life on Earth is directly or either directly or indirectly dependent on plants performing photosynthesis. Now, there are places, like I just mentioned, like at the bottom of the ocean, or deep down in a cave, where there is no sunlight, and there's the way that food is produced in those types of systems is very unusual and different. But like I said, almost everywhere, especially on land, the organisms are completely dependent upon plants to get food into the food chain, into the food web. And that goes for humans as well. Human beings are 100% dependent upon plants. Either we're eating plants or eating animals that eat plants and to obtain our food. So it's a very important kingdom. All these kingdoms are very important, but it's easy to see how plants are really important for us. All right, so now the last biological kingdom that we need to cover, and actually the last one, the fourth of the four biological kingdoms in the domain Eukarya, is the one that we are absolutely most familiar with. That is the kingdom Animalia. So, like plants, most people can recognize members of the animal kingdom, although sometimes people don't realize that things that are animals actually are animals, or they don't think to call them animals. But the kingdom Animalia is a kingdom made up of complex, multicellular organisms that lack cell walls, can usually move around and quickly respond to their environment. Actually, this lacking cell walls is one of the distinguishing characteristics of the kingdom Animalia. It's the only biological kingdom, apart from protists, kingdom Protista, that has organisms with no cell wall in their cells. Generally in the kingdom Protista, the protozoans will not have a cell wall either. They're the animal-like protist. But then, apart from that, the animals are the only organisms that do not have a cell wall in their cells. Well, lots of examples of animals that we're familiar with. We have sponges, worms, insects, fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals are some of the major groups of animals. Now, like fungi, but unlike plants, animals must consume other organisms to obtain food and energy. So animals are like fungi in that they're consumers. They have to eat other things, they have to consume other organisms or other organic material to get energy, to get their food and to get energy. Not able to make food on their own like plants are. So all animals are multicellular. So this is similar to plants. Kingdom Plantae contains the plants. They're all multicellular, all of them. And also, likewise, for the kingdom Animalia, all animals are multicellular. There is no single-celled animal. So, now most animals also have highly specialized sense organs. This is true of almost all the animals except for the simplest of animals. So, we recognize this in our own cells. Human beings are in our own selves. Human beings are biologically classified as being in kingdom Animalia. We have specialized sense organs, and we recognize this. We see this in the other animals that we observe. We see things like we have a nose. Other mammals and other types of animals that are not even mammals have noses. We have eyes, ears, and nervous system. Most animals that you encounter have all of these things. Even the simplest animals, though, still have specialized sense organs for the most part. So we all know that dogs, cats, and dolphins are animals. So we think of these things as animals. If I asked the whole class to name animals, almost all of you would name something like a dog or a cat or a dolphin or maybe a bird. But mostly we'd be sticking to mammals, actually, when we are naming animals. Most of us, human beings, would not say, would be very narrow in the animals that we listed. We would not say things like worms, insects, coral, jellyfish. These are all also animals. Worms are animals, insects are animals, coral, that makes coral reefs, jellyfish, these are all animals as well. They have cells that do not have a cell wall. They're consumers, and they move around. They have specialized sense organs, most of them at least, except for the very simplest. So these are animals. Now, some animals are so simple that they may not be thought of as animals at all. And the simplest of all animals are the sponges. Sponges don't seem to do anything that animals do. Sponges are generally considered to be the simplest of all animals. And when you look at a sponge, if you see a living sponge underwater, they live underwater in fresh and salt water, they don't do anything. They just sit there. They appear to be more similar to plants by far than animals. So sponges don't move. They don't have any kind of sense organs. They don't have any of these specialized sense organs that most other animals do have. Sponges don't have this. However, sponges are considered animals and not plants or fungi, and this is because when you look at their cells, first of all, they are multicellular organisms. When you look at their cells do not have cell walls. 100% of all plants have cell walls in their body. 100% of all fungi have cell walls in their cells. And they also eat. Sponges eat other organic material. So they eat other organisms to obtain food and energy. Sponges are what we call filter feeders. So basically, over here on the right side, you see a picture of a sponge, and you can see on this sponge, it's got the body of the sponge has this. It's sort of like a tube. So you see this sort of circle right here, and then you see the body, which is this long tube. Okay, well, basically the way that the sponge feeds is that it pulls water in through the sides of its body, and then the water is then pumped out of this central tube. As that water passes through the walls of the sponge, it filters out organic material and maybe even very small animals and digests them and uses them as food, and then pumps out the water. They're filter feeders. It's actually really good for the water. It cleans the water. It keeps the water clean. And clams and mussels feed in a similar way as well, cleaning the water, very good at filtering out organisms from the water. And so this is what sponges do. They feed, and that's what animals do. They have no cell walls, so they're considered to be animals, even though they don't move, they don't have specialized sense organs. But even so, they are the simplest of all animals. All right, that's it for our Unit 7 notes, and our talking about classification systems, the levels of classification, binomial nomenclature, and then going through our kingdom survey, just going through looking at all the biological kingdoms and the domains that those kingdoms fall under. All right, that's it.